what I would say is that we're no longer just a performing rights organization. We like to say we're a music rights organization. We've expanded into mechanical rights with the acquisition about 2-3 years ago of the Harry Fox Agency. We're also actively involved in licensing music internationally now. We have a joint venture that's focused initially in Europe, but is really in the early stages of going worldwide, called Mint. It's a platform for licensing all the major digital platforms around the world. So we span a wider range within the music publishing universe of rights than ASCAP or BMI or global. We're a multi-territory licensing entity as opposed to one that's focused on any single individual territory.
Okay. You know, I spend so much time doing repertory searches on whether it's Sony ATV, you guys, ASCAP, BMI. How huge of an undertaking is one database, one global database?
Well, again, I don't want to bore people, but because it is somewhat arcane, but there was an initiative called the GRD, which is the Global Rights Database, by the world's family of performing rights organizations to create one central global data asset. It's, I'm not sure whether they spent $20 million, $30 million, but all they produced for that investment was documentation, and the thing ultimately collapsed under its own weight. So one of the initial challenges is just from a behavioral standpoint in terms of getting people to think about creating an asset like that and conducting their business in the marketplace in a way that's consistent with its objectives. It is an enormously complicated task. You know, the way in the digital world today, the way copyrights, musical compositions get monetized, you start with the sound recording. That sound recording needs to be linked. There might be 10 sound recordings of one individual composition. Then you have to link from the composition to the publishers and the writer for the performing rights as well as the mechanical rights. It is an enormously complicated task. It's something which, in the world of infinite computing capacity, you know, is by all means doable. But you know, getting the data in, you know, there's a lot of scrubbing of the data that needs to be done because errors that are made in tracking the title of a song that may not exactly match the way it's registered with the Copyright Office. You need to really actually use these data assets in the marketplace to discover errors so that you can address them. That's probably the most effective, because the most effective way to get people to find out when you've got bad data is when somebody's out there who feels that they should be getting paid. You'll definitely hear from them in that circumstance as opposed to just, you know, altruistically supplying the information. There has to be a real commercial purpose behind it. So from my perspective, it's definitely something that's doable. Certainly in the United States, that's one of the things that's contemplated by the MMA, is to create a centralized data asset. I think the original contemplation was that it would apply principally to mechanical rights, but it's been expanded to include performing rights, and there's no reason why one can't do that. But I would tell you, and I think any of the players in the marketplace who tried to create this kind of data asset will attest to the fact that it's very, very complicated. And, you know, it's a big hill to climb, but definitely doable and getting easier. Not easy, but easier, relatively speaking, all the time, just because of what's available in the marketplace from a data and technology standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it's all there. It just needs to be
It needs to be corralled, but the corralling is not an inconsequential task.
And by the way, that does happen, like I mentioned Lisa Loeb earlier, because I know her manager, but she has a song called Stay, which was a huge hit in 1993. Rihanna has a song called Stay. Lisa gets Rihanna's royalties like all the time, you know, and it's like, it's mistakes that happens constantly.
Yeah, I mean, you know, being in one of these businesses and having bought it and buying it, being cognizant of a lot of the legacy issues that it had, those are always cringeworthy moments. And people have a right to expect perfection. And the reality is that the level of performance is improving continuously. That's the most important thing, because it's the old Chinese proverb of every journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. As long as there's continuous improvement, ultimately you're going to get to a level of standard that's acceptable. But people expect 100% performance, and that's, again, another thing. I think Today we're at 95, 96% accuracy. I think we can get to 99% accuracy, but without some changes in the way music gets uploaded to the digital platforms, I don't think you'll ever get to 100% because some of that information is never provided to people like Spotify.
Which was a huge problem, that Spotify didn't have metadata.
Correct.
And in the last year, they finally added credits where you can self-add your credit.
Correct.
So it's getting there. Last question. Neil Diamond is one of the CSAC affiliates, and he was just honored at the Songwriters Hall of Fame. He's someone who's had dozens of hits, not just for himself, but for other singers. If you were, let's say, you had 25% of one track on a Kendrick Lamar album, can you make a living as a songwriter?
I mean, I think it's the prospect of making, it really goes back to what Don said before. I was thinking about this yesterday, as it relates principally actually on the television side to business models like Netflix. But in the past, if you had commercial success, the sky was the limit. You could sell 1 million albums, 2 million, 3 million, 10 million, whatever. In today's world, you're really competing for a finite pool of dollars when you look at the digital platforms, just focusing on those for the moment. So I think it's much, much harder for people to get rich in today's world than it was before. I do believe that it's easier now than it was perhaps 3 or 4 years ago, and I think it will be easier 3 years from now than it is today to make a living as a writer. But, making a living as a writer is very, very difficult. And if you look at some of there's very sketchy data, and, the people who are opponents of the music industry who engage in collective negotiations trying to minimize licensing fees like to point to the fact that there's been explosive growth in the number of affiliates of entities like ASCAP and PMI over the last 20 years. But 99% of those people aren't making a living from music. The journey person, writer, who, it's tough. I think it's, and it doesn't have, the potential to retire off of one hit is very, I think, much, much more difficult to envision today than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Right, they used to call it mailbox money.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Now it's like you're lucky if you get a fraction of a cent.
But that also misses the fact that, as these platforms scale, there's going to be, significantly more money in the ecosystem, but it's not like, it doesn't, as an individual, your ability to read bridges is much more constrained, I think, than it was, at the height of the CD boom.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Yes.
My question is, you guys have touched upon the accuracy of payments. Have you thought about utilizing some form of blockchain?
I mean, blockchain, my view on blockchain is the following. I think you'd have to be very ignorant to be in the music business today and not spend time learning about it and meeting with people, focusing on the companies that are in the market and really looking at what people are trying to do to innovate with it. But blockchain as a technology relies on the accuracy of what's known as a foundation block, which is the initial conceptual data entry for who owns that right. And in our industry, you have two things. You have a lot of disputes over who owns the work, and you also have a phenomenon with new releases where it's often the case that the music publishing rights are registered from an ownership perspective after the music is actually released in the marketplace. So I think there are real issues around that would need to be addressed behaviorally within the industry on how you get to a place where there's an authoritative foundation block. And then I think you have an additional two behavioral issues within the industry. One is on the artist side. I've been in negotiations since I joined the company, trying to convince major publishing companies to partner with us, and basically on a fully transparent basis, we would share all information on how we're going to license their works, and they can share the upside for that. But they have to be our partner, so they have to be willing to take a risk. And it's not really a big risk because you can demonstrate that the odds of them making less than they were before. nobody wants to take risks. People want guarantees. They want money today instead of take. So, you know, I think that's another issue. If people were really willing to make more money over time by not getting guaranteed advance money today, I think I'd be much more constructive on how soon blockchain penetrates. And then the third thing is, we have, you know, we at CSAC license, I don't know whether it's 750,000 or 1 million individual counterparties we license music to. Getting to a place where those entities are interested in a technology where they're going to pay on a per transaction basis, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with blockchain. So, you know, I think, will blockchain become a payment, you know, the default payment methodology for music rights in the future? It certainly is very likely that at some point in the future it will be. Will music be the first industry that blockchain penetrates? I personally doubt it, but we do spend a lot of time following it and learning about it, and it's a bright, shiny thing for the industry that people like to talk about, so it has a lot of sex appeal, but I think when you step back and think about it, it's likely to be, you know, quite some time before it has a real major commercial impact on the industry.
Thank you. Yes, Alan?
The number of people who are getting credit for songs in rising. And curious if you ever figured why.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally that's a function of two things. One is urban. Urban is a music genre that involves A, a lot of sampling, and B, just behaviorally, you know, it's a bunch of people get into a studio, create something, and all get credit for it. So that's one thing. The other thing is just the phenomenon of squatting, which is where the artist who performs the work requires an ownership interest in the composition in order to perform it and popularize it, has grown in significance over the past 20, 30 years, which makes sense commercially, particularly, you know, given the changing dynamics of how you market your releases. My guess is that it's largely a function of those two phenomena. So. Go ahead.
You have a lot of counterparties you're working with as PROs from around the world. What are you seeing coming down the pike globally?
Well, the first thing I see, you know, when we formed this joint venture with Suiso, which is the Swiss collective management organization, to really become a multi-territory license, you know, that sort of is breaking glass within our industry, because historically it's been a very, you know, people just respect everyone else's territorial exclusivity. So what I'm seeing from our particular vantage point is a lot of pushback on innovation to try and drive towards it. You know, if you think about it from Spotify's perspective, they run a global business. They'd like to be in a position where they could push one button, clear all the rights they need, both on the sound recording and the composition side, and move on with their life and really focus on the customer experience and marketing their product. As you know, instead they're focused with this very arcane, highly fragmented licensing regime where, you know, it's territory by territory in large part, and you know, even fragmented with individual rights categories. So what we're seeing in the short run is a lot of pushback by a lot of the incumbent societies around the world to try and preserve the status quo, which is very cushy for them. They are all nominally artist or writer-owned organizations that exist for the benefit of the writers, but there's a fairly significant disconnect in the sense that the people who are running them, you know, aren't necessarily, you know, they're really running them to perpetuate the organization and for the lifestyle that it creates for them. In a lot of territories in Europe in particular, you have these social and cultural deductions that they take off the top, which is fairly unaccountable, non-transparent money. You know, there's a inequity in the sense that U.S. works tend to generate more money internationally than international works generate in the U.S. So we're owed more money from the rest of the world than we owe the rest of the world typically, and yet we're getting hit with these deductions and this lack of transparency. So we're in the early stages of a sort of instinctive response to try and preserve the status quo. I think it's just a matter of time between, you know, before that gets blown up. We're fortunate in the sense that, you know, with Blackstone, the fund from Blackstone that invested with us is a new one that they just started, which is designed to hold investments for at least 15 plus years. So we have a very long time horizon to think about making some of these changes. And you have to have that, because achieving any change in the music industry you know, that's one of my big learning moments since I joined, coming from a transactional business. You know, nothing happens quickly, and you have to be patient, and you have to be respectful of, you know, the interests that other people have, your counterparties have, why they're fighting to hold on, and you just have to really just continuously be working to achieve, and, you know, just expect that it's going to be a gradual progression. But there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't end up, certainly for digital, 5 years from now plus, with, you know, the ability, a fewer number of societies licensing to the global platforms across the entire world. It just doesn't make sense any other way.